morning. Welcome to the Fox Valley Catholic Bible Study Group. Glad to see that all of you got up this morning, gathered together to talk about and study a little bit of the Word of God. Just a couple of days ago, we had the feast of one of the most beloved saints in the church. What an old brown robe. Who do you think it is? St. Francis of Assisi. Right, so be kind to your animals today. It'd be appropriate for us to begin this morning with the prayer of St. Francis. Huh? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And please join me if you remember the prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is hope. And where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in parting that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, now, I like that part. It is in giving that we receive, and I think that, this should be a time of the year. Thanksgiving is coming up, so how can we give thanks unless we're given something? So take a couple of those cards and spread the word and give them out this week, okay? You stop to think of how you started coming here. It's probably someone that invited you, or you saw one of the articles in the paper. So we'd like to, as we begin a new section, but we're still trying to finish up the apocryphal or hidden or deuterocanonical books of the Bible. We were studying for about 4 months the book of Sirach. We finished up chapter 39, but the rest of it just goes through, and it's basically a commentary on the history of Israel. But last week, one of the last things I talked about from the book of Sirach was he pointed us in the direction of the time period of the Maccabees. And the first and second books of Maccabees, those two are the last sections of what is called the apocryphal or hidden books of the Bible. Now, for those of you who have been hanging around here for a few years, you take a look at the new outline that we have for the intertestamental Maccabean literature, and it might look familiar because it was long ago, 4 years ago, that we went through the books of Maccabees. But we have some people here who weren't here at that time, and I want to kind of finish off this series. So we're gonna go back through the first and second books of Maccabees, and you know how I am. I always add a little, sidebar kind of stuff. But we're going to go through rather quickly through the first and second books of Maccabees. Okay, at least I'm going to try. Needless to say, you probably picked up already. I kind of like history. I kind of like the Bible history, and taking an approach, a biblical approach that is contextual, looking at the larger context from which things come out of. You know, sometimes I have to confess, I get kind of bogged down because I keep asking questions. What about this? What about that? What about, you know, this? How does this fit in with that? And, you know, what's the larger, you know, picture? Give me the larger picture. Okay. So we're going to kind of do that for you in the first and second book of Maccabees, and not so much get into essentially our study of Sirach. It became, you know, almost what is called exegetical, which is a formal biblical term for, in a sports analogy, they would say taking a book and breaking it down. Okay, you read about, you know. In sports, professional sports, yeah, they looked at video and broke it down. They broke down the film, broke it. So exegesis is taking a book of the Bible and breaking it down. So we kind of ended up with quasi-exegetical with Sirach. Done with that now. Okay, so we're going to Maccabees. Now, just a little reminder. The books, first and second book of Maccabees, they fall in the area what's called the apocryphal books. They are usually the last of the 7 books of the Old Testament canon that you find in Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles. But you wouldn't find these in a Protestant Bible unless the Protestant Bible has in the back an appendix with what they call the apocryphal. Of course, we as Catholics, we don't call them these 7 books apocryphal. We call they're called the deuterocanonical, or the second canon books. Now, it's kind of interesting, the history. I don't know how much I want to get into this, I'm sorry. The Maccabeans. The Maccabean books, it's almost, well, there was a kind of an evolution of what we call the Hebrew canon, or what we call today the Old Testament. All right, and you know, some people think, okay, take the prophets. All right, the prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. You think after they gave, you know, their prophecies and so on, some scribe was writing it down, making multiple copies, and passing it out in the streets of Jerusalem? Or did the Jews go to, you know, at that time and get, you know, the latest writing from Mr. Jeremiah at the Jerusalem bookstore in downtown Jerusalem? No, it didn't happen that way, okay? All right? First of all, they didn't mass produce, you know, the writing. Secondly, a lot of times the writing, the prophecies and so on were not written down until a lot later, and finally edited centuries later into the form that we see as those books today. So there was a, you know, evolution of these books. The books of the Maccabees, of the 7 books, these are the most historical. First and Second Maccabees. They deal with a historical time period that was significant for the Hebrew people. And so it's important that we spend a little time with them. And they are from the time period that comes right before the New Testament time period. Right before, it kind of sets the stage, if you will. Because the New Testament time period, time of Jesus, the milieu, the cultural milieu at that time was what? Roman? Greek, Greco-Roman, right? So these books, First and Second Maccabees, dramatically and historically show us the infusion of Greek culture coming about 300 years before Christ. How did that happen? And who was a part of that, and so on. So that's what we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks. Yeah, the Greek world, historical background. Basically, they talk about the Greek era. Just in world history. Well, basically, it would be from 333 to 63 BC. 63 is the not the dawning, but it's the flourishing of the Roman era. So who's around in 33 BC? Huh? Alexander the Great, right?
333.
Yeah, 333. So, Alexander, we call him Alexander the Great, right? Son of Philip of Macedonia. And Alexander, had this great dream, this great vision of extending the Greek influence and conquer as much of the world as possible. By the year 331, he had done a pretty good job of conquering Egypt and setting up as a very important city, which he named after himself, Alexandria. By 326, he and his armies moved to what we call today as Palestine, and then further east. And as he went further and further east, he and his armies were able to conquer the Persians, what was left of the Persian Empire, the Parthians, and it can be argued that he went as far as the culture that was in the Indus Valley, which we call today India, right? Hindu. So, now it was like a blitzkrieg, so to speak, because by 321, Alexander the Great dies. This is all BC. What we call BC, what some scholars today call BCE, before the Common Era. So he dies. Okay. Who's a smart historian here? Where did Alexander die?
In Persia.
No, he was wounded in Persia.
Persepolis?
No. Good guess, though. Where did Alexander die? Krakow. Sheptusky, of course. That answer, Krakow, comes from Sheptusky.
He wanted to die close to heaven.
Yes. Someone shouted Babylon. So basically, once he took over after his father's death, it was basically a little more than 10 years, and then he himself died. Actually, I think he gave him too much life. It's 323. It's unbelievable how quickly they spread east, and almost immediately after his death, his great empire. What happened to our maps?
Yeah.
Oh.
They're in the closet.
They're in the closet. Map. No, that's all right, Tom. That's all right. Next class, bring the maps out. Okay. So. Maps should not be in a closet. Bring them out of the closet. Okay. So almost immediately, his empire got divided between his generals. And oftentimes they say there's 3 sections. So one section, General Ptolemy, and one section, General Seleucus, okay, and the third section divided amongst his family and fought over by others. So Ptolemy basically got Egypt. At the time, Palestine went along with Egypt at that. Seleucid got the region Syria and what we call Iran and Iraq and today. It wasn't called that back then, huh? And then his family, those who remained in Greece. Now, when we approach the study of the Maccabees, basically it's a story of a revolt led by this family, Maccabean family. Later on they'll be called something else in history, between 175 and 135. By that time, Egypt had been, and Palestine in that region had been fought over between the armies of the Ptolemies and the Seleucid. And at the time of the Maccabees, when they lived, that the Seleucid generals and their successors had control over what we know as Jerusalem today and Judea and those lands. Now, there's a lot of a lot of things that happen. Some good, some bad. So, when the Ptolemies were in charge of Egypt, there was a sizable population of Jews in and around Egypt yet. Okay? And, basically the Greeks were tolerant of the Jews. Maybe the population was big enough that they had to be tolerant of them. But there was I have to check, what branch he was from. Yeah. There was Ptolemy the Fourth, nicknamed Philadelphus, established a great library in Alexandria after, of course, Alexander died. Ptolemy the Fourth lived and reigned as king about 286 to roughly 240. So it's in that time period. And because they had conquered these other places, he wanted to build up and establish that library as an ongoing an archive, repository of learning that they had accumulated through this is what, 50 years, maybe less than 50 years after Alexander died, to put all that learning in one place. And of course, the Alexandrian library was going to be one of the great wonders of the world, and significant. Now, because there was quite a few Jews in Egypt, Alexandria is in Egypt, up there in the northwest corner, he asked or commissioned that there would be a translation of the Hebrew scrolls into Greek so that he could read them. Okay? And of course that translation we've talked about here before became known as the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament was Septuagint. Yes. Identified by the Roman numerals LXX, or 70, because supposedly 70 scholars worked on this and worked on the translation and so on. Now, that was a significant thing. But these books, the books of the Maccabees, wouldn't have been a part of that collection. Why?
They weren't written until 100 BC.
That's right. They weren't written until towards the end of the 100s, because the Jews had revolted against not the Ptolemies, but the Seleucids, who had defeated the Ptolemies and defeated their lands, where the Jews live, especially in Jerusalem, and Palestine, and so on. Now, there's all kinds of battles, and if you're interested in that, just Google it up, and under Alexander the Great, if you will, and it'll give you a whole, history of all that if you're interested in that. I'm not going to get into that, but By the time we get the beginning of what would become known as the Maccabean revolt, the land of Palestine had been under the Seleucids, and there was, what was it, the third or fourth Seleucid king was a man named Antiochus. Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Epiphanes, or Epiphanes, a term which he gave to himself, nickname, which meant manifest, because he saw himself as the manifestation of the Greek god Zeus come down to earth. Okay. Although the Jews ended up with their own nickname for him. Yeah. The Jewish nickname for him was Epiphanes. You want to know what that meant?
Yeah, sure.
Why didn't you raise your hand and say, well, what does that mean, Father?
Knew you'd get to it.
Madman.
Oh, like Dr.
Madman. Okay. So that was their nickname, the Jewish nickname for it. Epiphanes. And what he wanted to do was to make sure all the Jews were adapting Hellenistic culture, Hellenistic religion. You know, you study Greek mythology, right? All those different gods and goddesses and so on. And worship at their shrines. And so that's what he was trying to do. And there's a part of the Jewish, population. We would call them, maybe they're like secular Jews. They kind of went, okay, we were conquered before by other madmen. Let's just go with the flow, and it will save our lives, and we'll, at home we'll worship Yahweh God, and we'll be all right. But if they want us to, live in these, ways like the Greeks and wear Greek clothes and go to their sporting events and so on. Yeah. The Greeks had sporting events, which greatly attracted Jewish youth. So this is about the same time that who was writing to Jewish youth and teaching Jewish youth? Huh? Sirach, right? So, Ben Sirach. So, the study that we just had in the book of Sirach and Ben Sirach, I'm plunging you into the historical milieu, the historical background of that time period. And, the Greek influence on youth, and in some of the Jewish families who were just, kind of wishy-washy about, the Jewish faith and so on. Let's just go with the flow and it'll save our lives. Well, that didn't sit very well with a certain family. And this certain family was going to become very important. Now, the family will end up being identified as the family of the Maccabees. The Maccabees is actually a nickname for hammer. And it was identified with
one of the sons, Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, because he was so diligent, not from the Greek standpoint, he was a fanatic and a fanatical terrorist, but from the Jewish standpoint, he was very, very faithful. Okay, guys, he led his brothers and others of their ilk in guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid king and the Greek influence. Now, it actually started with their dad, Matthias. Now, these Maccabeans were from a village out in the foothills called Medellin. And if I had a map, I could show you. Remind me next week to show you on the map. So, make a note. Good. So, if you think of the map of Israel, okay, I mean biblical Israel, okay, and you know where Jerusalem is, and Bethlehem is 7 miles south, okay, and 40 miles north is 40 miles north is Samaria from Jerusalem. So Medellin is about halfway between Bethlehem and Samaria, off to the east. Oh. So,
I'll forget next week.
yeah.
There.
Thank you very much. How many of you remember Bishop Sheen's TV shows? Okay. So he wrote on a blackboard with chalk, right? Yeah. And, yeah. Bishop Sheen had his angel. We have bald-headed Kevin. They didn't have, we don't either. Let's see if this map has it. No, that's New Testament times. That won't help us. Father, why do you go through this? Because I feel that it is important. Why do you feel it's important, Father? Because when you're talking about history, one thing that proves, there are two basic principles that prove something or someone to be historic. Number one, when they lived. Number two, where they lived. If you can't prove where they lived, or when they lived, or where it happened, and when it happened, then you question the historicity of them or the event. Basic principle, right? Now, I don't know if they have Medina on here. It would be wonderful if they did. They don't. So, basically, here's Jerusalem, and Bethlehem is just south of it. Here's the area of Samaria, okay? Medellin would be out here, just about in the Shephelah, or foothills, of the Judean mountains, close to the, real close to Beth Horon. And it's not on that map because that map is indicating places from the older time period. Now, this family, and there was a series of boys from Matthias and after Judas and his other brothers that took him, they began this revolt against Epiphanes. Antiochus. And it started almost like guerrilla warfare. But there's something else that he did, and it is recorded in 2 Maccabees, actually, chapter 2. And I want you to look at this. So flip open your Bibles to 2 Maccabees, chapter 2. So, here it's talking about, and this is even before the preface, it's talking about letters to the Jews that came out of Egypt about 125 years BC. And it indicates, the author of this is trying to indicate the verification, certification, authorization, if you will, of the historical roots and background for the Jewish people. He talks about Solomon and Moses passing on, like the law, and Solomon, the wisdom literature. 2 Maccabees chapter 2. Verse 13. Besides these things, it is also told in the records and in Nehemiah's record, memoirs. Nehemiah. If you went to daily mass just the other day, or the last couple of days we had at daily mass, the first reading was from Nehemiah, and it was about Ezra, the prescribed, after the Babylonian exile, and they returned to Babylon, it had Ezra reading out from the book of the law of Moses, the translation, and having translated for the Jewish people in Jerusalem that had been rebuilt. Now, Ezra, I know there's a book of Ezra, right? But it's not that is not found in the book of Ezra. Well, there's a version of it, but it's actually accounted in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. So Nehemiah was like the governor that was placed by the Persians in Jerusalem to help the resettlement of the Jews from the Babylonian exile, and to see that the monies that the Persian government were giving to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple would be used, for that appropriate purpose. But here, Nehemiah's memoirs, how he collected books about the kings, the writings of the prophets and of David, and the royal letters about sacred offerings. In like manner also Judas, he's talking about Judas Maccabees, also collected for us the books that had been scattered because of the war, and we now have them in our possession. If you need them, send messengers to get them for you. Some of your translations, instead of books, might have scrolls. I don't know if you have that. But this is kind of an interesting passage, because it indicates to us the three main sections of Jewish literature. The three main sections: the law of Moses, the prophets, and the writings of David, including letters on sacred offerings, and then the writings from that are being written, the kind of chronology that Judas Maccabees is indicating. And they must have had people translating these and spreading them around. Chances are it was not in Greece, because the Maccabean family hated the Greeks. They couldn't stand the Greeks. That's why they carried on guerrilla warfare against the Greeks. They couldn't stand the Greek influence. So do you think they used the Septuagint version? No. No. Okay. And besides, there was an indication, I don't know if you picked that up, if you went to Mass yesterday and heard about the priest Ezra reading out from the book of the law, but it also said there were Levites there translating for the people. So if he's reading from the book of the law of Moses, the Torah, and if the Torah is written in Hebrew, and Hebrew was the main language of the Jewish people, why didn't they understand it?
I thought they spoke Aramaic.
Ah, because they spoke Aramaic. So the Levites, for the common people, had to translate the Hebrew into Aramaic, so the Jewish people at that time period, about 500 years before Christ, could understand what their religious books were teaching them. Okay? So, all right.
Father, how much was lost in all those translations?
Well, I mean, we could bring that up, and there's no way to identify that. But the other, important question would be, how many of the other books were lost? Okay? So we'll be studying here 1st and 2nd book of Maccabees. If you have an Orthodox Bible, an Orthodox Bible will have 3rd Maccabees. And there's indications in the writings of the fathers of the church that there was a 4th Maccabees. Okay? But it's not part of the Catholic canon of Scripture. 3rd and 4th Maccabees, it's not there. And of course, they're not in the Protestant Bibles either. And only the Orthodox Bible will have actually 3rd Maccabees as well, but not 4th. Okay? But because basically the 4th Maccabees, has been lost in antiquity and so on. But we know that there was, because the early fathers of the church talk about it and wrote about it. Okay, so that's more of the question. Okay, just like that, we have the book of Ezra, the prophet I mentioned, or the priest that translate. Well, there is also known 2nd Ezra and 3rd Ezra. As part of what we call Old Testament Apocrypha. They didn't make it in either. Although some people would say that parts of that was assumed in some other books of the Old Testament canon that we have. All right? So, just very quickly going through a Maccabean, well, let me finish. Hasmonean dynasty. Later on, the Jewish or Roman historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, he was a Jew. Initially, he revolted in the Jewish revolt against the Romans, but then he flipped and he went over to the Roman side and began to chronicle all the battles and the destruction of Jerusalem and so on. Flavius Josephus, and he wrote a number of different books, the history of the Jews and so on. And Josephus calls this period of time the period of the Maccabeans. He identifies this as the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty. And it's because by the time we get towards the 1st century of the Common Era, most of the high priests in Jerusalem are the tail end of this family in this dynasty. Okay? But they changed. And I might get to, not today, showing you how they changed from being ardent believers in Jewish orthodoxy, and all the Jews living in Palestine and around Jerusalem have to get back to the orthodoxy of following the Mosaic law and so on. And that was the strong feeling of, Matthias and his son Judas the hammer, and to bring about Jewish orthodoxy amongst them and not being influenced by Greek culture and so on. No. 2 or 3 generations, 4 generations later, because initially the Greeks and later the Romans offered to the members of this family not only, kind of semi-political powers, but also those conquering people, the Greeks and Romans, set members of that family up as high priest, even though they were not a part of the Aaron and the Levites family, okay? The tribes that were identified as priests. They were not. But politically, they were set up because it was politically expedient for those who had control. In order that they stopped the guerrilla warfare that the early Maccabees came on, they had the great-great-grandchildren end up being the local leaders as well as high priests. And they saw that would be expedient for them. That dynasty then was called Hasmonean, later on by Flavius Josephus. And why did he use that name? It doesn't connect with Maccabean or so on, because Matthias's daddy's name was Asamoni. Asamoni. So you see that incorporated in Hasmonia, as it was transliterated later on into Latin.
Father, just as you say, the commentary says that the whole reason that the books of Maccabees were written was to justify the kingship of the Hasmoneans and the high priesthood, since they weren't related to David or Levi.
They weren't related to David or Levi, so as a justification, some say, particularly as Josephus showed in his presentation of that history. So, all right. Now I mentioned the Maccabean literature. First book of Maccabees we have in our Bible. Second book we have. The first book of Maccabees, basically you want to put a time period connected with that, 175 to 104 BC. 175 to 104 BC. Second book of Maccabees, which is actually an abridgment of 5 volumes of history of the Maccabees that no longer exist. That's basically from 180 BC to 161 BC. And maybe a little bit later on this month, it will be appropriate if I can plan this out and if we can move along. We'll get to the second book of Maccabees around November 1st, and when we celebrate All Souls Day, because part of the theology that we find, Jewish theology in second book of Maccabees, will be the pre-Christian basis for the teaching on resurrection of the just, the intercession of saints in heaven, and the power of offering prayers and sacrifices for the dead by living people. So what we do as part of All Souls Day and All Saints Day, and that, honor in our understanding of the resurrection of the just, intercession of saints in heaven, and offering of prayers and sacrifices for those who have died. That those pre-Christian concepts and ideas have their biblical roots in the second book of Maccabees. And it's part of the ongoing battles that they have. Third book of Maccabees, which we don't have in our Bibles anyhow, we find in the Eastern Christianity. Well, incidentally, I wanted to tell you, there's a lady here in this parish that she joined a few months ago. For 20 years, she has split off and joined the Orthodox Church. And now she's very sickly and so on, so she's coming back to the Catholic Church. So I went to visit her, and she showed me 2 Bibles. She said, when I die, I want to be buried with these 2 Bibles. One was a well-used Orthodox Bible, and the other one was lesser used, but still obviously used, New Jerusalem Bible. So she was using both the Orthodox and the New Jerusalem Bible. And she said, and I said, can I see that Orthodox Bible? I never really looked at an Orthodox Bible. I talk about Orthodox, all the time. And so she showed it to me and so on. And right away I flipped open the index to see, which of these books they had and so on. So a couple of weeks later, she comes in a wheelchair, she comes to church. Here, Father, I have a gift for you. She gives me an Orthodox Bible. Yeah. I said, I thought you wanted to be buried with it. Well, I do. I still have my own. I bought this for you. So I actually have now an Orthodox Bible that I'm able to check these things and so on. And it does include third book of Maccabees. Okay.
What years?
Huh?
What years?
What years? 221 to 203 BC. It describes the persecution of Jews in Egypt under Ptolemy V. So here it seems like Ptolemy IV, Philadelphus, at this time period was favorable to the Jews. He has to have the Jewish scriptures translated into Greek, right? So either his son or his grandson, Ptolemy V, I think there was someone else in between after he died, just turned and was against the Jews. So the third book of Maccabees shows that. All right, now, well, I've been rattling on here, and I didn't even get to where I wanted to go, but I do have to go over the Sacred Heart this morning, so I want to cut it off here, and we'll pick it up next time. Roman numeral 3, First Maccabees, the milieu. Let's talk about kind of the Greek mindset as they were going into this. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. Spread the word. Take some cards, pass them around.